Number 1. NXIVM. In 2017, a self-improvement organization that had been operating for nearly 2 decades finally revealed its darkest secret. NXIVM, pronounced Nexium like the heartburn medication, presented itself as an executive success program that promised to unlock human potential. Its seminars attracted everyone from Hollywood actresses to heirs of billion-dollar fortunes. Members paid thousands of dollars for workshops that claimed to break through psychological barriers and create extraordinary success. The organization had centers across multiple countries and boasted a following of roughly 16,000 people who had taken at least one course. On the surface, it looked like any other personal development company in an industry filled with charismatic speakers and expensive retreats. But beneath the polished marketing materials and testimonials from satisfied clients, something far more sinister was taking place. Keith Raniere founded NXIVM in 1998 in Albany, New York. He had previously been involved in a multi-level marketing company that was investigated for being a pyramid scheme, but he managed to reinvent himself as a guru of human potential. Raniere styled himself as one of the smartest men in the world, claiming to have an IQ of 240 and mastery over multiple disciplines. He was called Vanguard by his followers, a title that suggested he was leading humanity into a new era of consciousness. His right hand was Nancy Salzman, a nurse and practitioner of neuro-linguistic programming who became known as Prefect. Together, they built NXIVM into a thriving enterprise that attracted wealthy and influential people seeking personal growth. The courses used a mixture of psychological techniques, some legitimate and some questionable, to break down participants' defenses and rebuild their thinking according to Raniere's philosophy. What made NXIVM different from other self-help organizations became clear only to those who reached the inner circles. In 2015, Raniere created a secret society within NXIVM called DOS, which stood for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, Latin for Master over Slave Women. This group was presented to recruited women as an exclusive sisterhood that would make them stronger through acts of commitment and sacrifice. Women were told they were joining an empowerment group for females only. What they didn't know at first was that Raniere was at the top of this pyramid, and every woman in DOS was ultimately serving him. The structure worked like a pyramid scheme of obedience. Each woman recruited others and became their master, but everyone answered to someone above them, and Raniere stood above everyone. Membership in DOS required disturbing demonstrations of loyalty. Women were told to provide collateral before being fully initiated, material that could destroy their lives if released. This collateral included explicit photographs, false confessions to crimes, and damaging information about their families. Once the collateral was submitted, there was no walking away without consequences. Members were put on extremely restricted diets, sometimes consuming only 500 calories per day, and were woken at odd hours for assignments. They were required to respond to texts within 60 seconds at any time of day or night. Some were ordered to engage in activities with Raniere that they did not consent to, under threat of their collateral being released. And in what became the most shocking revelation, women were held down and branded with a cauterizing pin. The brand was designed to include Raniere's initials, though members were initially told it was a symbol of the elements. The branding sessions happened in a home in Albany, with women holding down other women while a cauterizing device burned the design into their skin near the pelvic area. No anesthetic was used, and the sessions were filmed. The unraveling began when one member left and spoke out. In 2017, former Dynasty actress Catherine Oxenberg went public about her daughter, India, being trapped in the organization. She had been trying for months to extract her daughter from what she recognized as a dangerous group. Around the same time, an expose in the New York Times detailed the secret society and the branding ceremonies. The article featured testimony from multiple women who had escaped and were willing to share their stories despite the collateral NXIVM held over them. Former members described years of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and being cut off from friends and family who questioned their involvement. The revelations sparked federal investigations. In March 2018, Keith Raniere was arrested in Mexico, where he had fled as the walls closed in. He was found in a luxury villa with multiple women, including one who had been confined there for nearly 2 years. Raniere was charged with an array of offenses including forced labor conspiracy, wire fraud conspiracy, and other serious crimes. Several of his top associates were also arrested, including Allison Mack, an actress known for her role on the television series Smallville. Mack had been one of the most active recruiters for DOS and had served as a master directly under Raniere. Nancy Salzman and her daughter Lauren, who had helped run NXIVM's operations, also faced charges. As the case built, prosecutors revealed that Raniere had exploited multiple women over the years, including one who had been underage when their involvement began. The trial began in May 2019 and lasted 6 weeks. Prosecutors presented testimony from numerous victims who detailed the manipulation and harm they experienced. The defense argued that everything was consensual and that participants in DOS had joined voluntarily. They claimed the branding was a bonding ritual that women had agreed to, and that NXIVM's practices, while unconventional, were not criminal. But the evidence painted a different picture. Witnesses described being coerced, threatened with collateral, and subjected to psychological abuse that made it nearly impossible to leave. The jury heard recordings of Raniere's own voice explaining his philosophies, including disturbing statements about women and power. After less than 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Raniere guilty on all counts. In October 2020, Keith Raniere was sentenced to 120 years in federal prison. The judge called him ruthless and unyielding in his desire for power, and described the immense harm he had caused to dozens of victims. Allison Mack received 3 years after pleading guilty and cooperating with prosecutors. Nancy Salzman was sentenced to 42 months, and her daughter Lauren received 5 years of probation. Other members of the inner circle received varying sentences based on their level of involvement and cooperation. Raniere continues to maintain his innocence and has filed appeals, but he remains incarcerated. Some former members have spoken publicly about their experiences and worked to help others recognize and escape manipulative groups. For nearly 20 years, NXIVM operated in plain sight, advertising its programs and attracting successful people who thought they were investing in personal growth. The organization destroyed families, drained bank accounts, and left psychological scars that many are still healing from. What appeared to be a path to empowerment became a system of control that reduced grown adults to fearful followers willing to harm themselves and others on command. The case serves as a reminder that manipulation doesn't always announce itself with obvious red flags, and that even intelligent, capable people can find themselves trapped in situations they never imagined they would tolerate. Number 2. Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. In the desert towns along the Utah-Arizona border, a religious community lived by rules that seemed frozen in time. Women wore prairie dresses in pastel colors, with their hair styled in elaborate braids. Men worked construction jobs and turned their paychecks over to the church. Families lived in massive homes that sometimes housed dozens of people under one roof. To outsiders driving through the towns of Hilldale and Colorado City, it looked like a quaint, if unusual, community that valued tradition and faith. But behind the modest clothing and the friendly waves, A system of control was operating that would eventually capture national attention and lead to one of the most disturbing religious prosecutions in modern American history. The Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the FLDS, had broken away from the mainstream Mormon Church over a century earlier, when the larger church abandoned the practice of plural marriage. While the mainstream church moved forward and grew into a worldwide religion, the FLDS retreated into isolated communities where they could continue practices they believed were commanded by God. Warren Jeffs was born into FLDS royalty in 1955. His father, Rulon Jeffs, led the church for decades and had at least 65 wives and dozens of children. Warren grew up in this world where having multiple wives was not just accepted, but celebrated as a sign of righteousness. He attended the church school and eventually became the principal, a position that gave him authority over the education and development of FLDS children. He was known as a strict disciplinarian who enforced rules with absolute certainty. When his father's health began failing in the late 1990s, Warren positioned himself as the natural successor. Some church members questioned whether he was the right choice, but Warren had spent years building loyalty among key followers. When Rulon Jeffs died in 2002, Warren declared himself the new prophet and president of the FLDS. His first acts as leader signaled that his reign would be different from his father's. He began excommunicating men from the community, sometimes for minor infractions or simply because he wanted their wives for himself or other favored members. Families were torn apart as fathers were cast out and told they would never see their children again unless they repented. Warren Jeffs ruled the FLDS with absolute authority. He claimed to receive revelations directly from God and expected immediate obedience to every command. He controlled where people lived, who they married, what they wore, what they could read, and what they could watch. He banned television, internet, newspapers, and most books. He determined which men were worthy of having wives and how many wives they would receive. Women had no say in who they married, and girls as young as 12 were told that God had chosen their husbands for them. Jeffs performed marriage ceremonies that had no legal standing but carried immense religious weight within the community. He married his own father's widows after Rulon died, taking on more than 70 wives himself. Among those wives were girls who were barely teenagers, including some who were related to him. He taught that plural marriage was required for the highest level of heaven and that women could only reach salvation through obedience to their husbands. Refusing a marriage assignment was portrayed as refusing God's will. The outside world began paying closer attention to the FLDS in the early 2000s as former members started speaking out. They described a culture of fear and control where questioning the prophet could result in losing everything. Men who were expelled found themselves cut off from wives and children with no legal recourse because the marriages were not recognized by the state. Women who tried to leave were hunted down and brought back. Children were taught that outsiders were evil and that government authority was illegitimate. In 2004, Jeffs made a decision that would prove to be his downfall. He performed a marriage between a 14-year-old girl named Alyssa, Wall, and her 19-year-old first cousin. Wall did not want the marriage and pleaded with Jeffs to release her from the arrangement. He told her to submit and repent of her resistance. The marriage was forced to proceed, and Wall found herself trapped in a situation she had not chosen with a person she did not want to be with. She would later become the key witness in bringing Jeffs to justice. In 2005, Warren Jeffs was charged with being an accomplice to the forced marriage of a minor. Rather than face the charges, he disappeared. He was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list in 2006, a rare distinction for a religious leader. For over a year, Jeffs traveled across the United States with a small group of loyal followers, moving between safe houses and hotels, dyeing his hair, and using fake identities. He recorded audio messages for his followers and continued to issue commands from hiding. Church members who knew where he was refused to cooperate with law enforcement. The search for Jeffs became a national story. In August 2006, a Nevada Highway Patrol officer pulled over a red Cadillac Escalade during a routine traffic stop near Las Vegas. Inside the vehicle were Warren Jeffs, one of his wives, and his brother. Officers found multiple cell phones, laptop computers, wigs, and over $50,000 in cash. Jeffs was taken into custody without incident. The legal process that followed was complicated by the fact that Jeffs had operated across multiple states. He was first tried in Utah in 2007 for being an accomplice to the forced marriage of Alyssa Wall. During the trial, Wall testified about being coerced into marriage at 14 and about the trauma she experienced. The defense argued that the marriage was consensual and that FLDS marriages were religious ceremonies protected by the First Amendment. The jury deliberated for over 16 hours before finding Jeffs guilty on both counts. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of 5 years to life in prison. However, the conviction was overturned on appeal in 2010 due to improper jury instructions. Before Utah could retry him, Texas moved forward with their own case. In 2008, authorities had raided the Yearning for Zion Ranch, an FLDS compound in El Dorado, Texas. The raid was based on calls reporting abuse, though those calls turned out to be a hoax. But what investigators found at the ranch was real evidence of underage marriages and other violations. They discovered documents that Jeffs had meticulously kept, including records of marriages and audio recordings of ceremonies. The Texas trial began in July 2011 and centered on 2 specific incidents. Prosecutors had evidence that Jeffs had married a 12-year-old girl and a 15-year-old girl, and they had DNA evidence proving he had fathered a child with the 15-year-old. They also had audio recordings that Jeffs himself had made, including one of a ceremony where he married the 12-year-old. During the trial, Jeffs initially represented himself and delivered rambling statements about religious persecution. He later brought back his attorneys but remained largely silent. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. The jury heard recordings and saw documents in Jeffs' own handwriting. After less than 30 minutes of deliberation, they found him guilty on 2 counts. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors played an audio recording that Jeffs had made of himself with the 12-year-old. The recording was so disturbing that some jurors were visibly upset. The jury recommended life in prison plus 20 years. Warren Jeffs is currently incarcerated in Texas and will likely never be released. He has continued to issue directives to his followers from prison, though his influence has diminished as more members have left the church. Some FLDS communities still exist and still revere him as a prophet, while others have splintered into different groups or abandoned the faith entirely. Alyssa Wall, the young woman whose testimony helped convict Jeffs in Utah, has written a book about her experience and works to help others who have left fundamentalist groups. The Yearning for Zion Ranch was eventually sold, and many of the families who lived there have relocated. Hilldale and Colorado City, the twin towns that served as FLDS headquarters for generations, have undergone significant changes as former members have gained control of local government and worked to create a more open community. The case of Warren Jeffs and the FLDS exposed how isolated religious communities can become breeding grounds for exploitation when a single leader claims absolute authority. For decades, Jeffs used religious doctrine to justify actions that harmed the most vulnerable members of his community. He destroyed childhoods, separated families, and created a system where saying no was not an option. The girls who were forced into marriages they did not want had their futures decided for them before they were old enough to understand what was happening. The men who were cast out lost their families overnight. The women who tried to leave were told they would be damned for eternity. What Jeffs called religion, the courts called crime. And the distinction mattered because it meant that victims finally had recourse, and that the man who had wielded unchecked power for years would face consequences he could not escape. Number 3. Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps. In a remote corner of New Mexico, a religious community called itself a missions training program, preparing believers for spiritual warfare. The Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps operated from a compound in Fence Lake, a tiny, unincorporated area where neighbors were few and questions were rare. The group presented itself as a strict but sincere Christian organization dedicated to training missionaries who would spread the gospel around the world. Members wore military-style uniforms, followed rigid schedules, and adhered to rules that governed every aspect of daily life. They published materials online and even had a website that outlined their beliefs and their mission. To those who stumbled across their presence, they seemed like an intense but harmless group of religious enthusiasts living out their faith in their own way. But former members who eventually escaped told a very different story about what life inside the compound was really like, and what was happening to the children who had no choice but to grow up under the absolute control of the group's leaders. The organization was founded by Deborah Green, who went by the title General Deborah. She and her husband Peter Green established the group in the 1980s, drawing on Deborah's Pentecostal background and a belief that mainstream Christianity had become too soft and too compromising. They taught that true believers needed to be soldiers for Christ, willing to endure hardship and discipline in service of God's kingdom. The Greens believed that physical punishment was not only acceptable, but necessary for driving out sin and rebellion. They quoted Bible verses about not sparing the rod and about discipline being a sign of love. Over time, they attracted followers who were drawn to the intensity of the message and the promise of being part of an elite group of believers who would not compromise with the secular world. Families joined the community and moved to the compound, giving up their outside lives to commit fully to the mission. Children born into the group knew nothing else, and children brought in by convert parents quickly learned that the rules inside the compound were unlike anything in the outside world. Life at the Aggressive Christianity compound was defined by control and punishment. Members woke early for prayer and physical training. They wore matching uniforms and marched in formation. Deborah Green made all major decisions and claimed to receive direct guidance from God. Those who questioned her authority were accused of rebellion and subjected to public humiliation or physical discipline. But it was the treatment of children that would eventually draw the attention of authorities. Former members reported that children were beaten regularly for minor infractions, or sometimes for no clear reason at all. The punishments were not simple spankings, but prolonged beatings with objects including boards, belts, and other implements. Children were struck on their bare skin hard enough to leave bruises and welts that lasted for days. Some beatings went on for extended periods, while the child was forced to remain in position. The stated purpose was to break the child's will and drive out sinful behavior, but the effect was trauma that many would carry for the rest of their lives. The Greens taught that children were inherently sinful and that strict discipline was the only way to save their souls. Crying during a beating was considered further evidence of rebellion and would result in more punishment. Children were required to thank their punishers afterward and to express gratitude for the correction. They were isolated from the outside world with no access to regular schooling, no interaction with children outside the group, and no exposure to media or information that contradicted what they were taught. Some children worked long hours doing manual labor around the compound or in businesses the group operated. They were told that suffering was part of their training and that enduring hardship would make them strong soldiers for Christ. Any child who expressed doubt or unhappiness was accused of having a rebellious spirit that needed to be beaten out of them. Parents who were part of the group either participated in the beatings themselves or stood by while leaders disciplined their children, believing they were doing what God required. The outside world remained largely unaware of what was happening inside the compound for years. The group was isolated geographically and kept a low profile in the surrounding area. Members did not interact much with neighbors and were trained to be suspicious of outsiders. But eventually, people started leaving. Some members who had been with the group for years began to question the teachings and the treatment of children. When they left, they took with them stories that were difficult to hear and even more difficult to ignore. Former members contacted authorities and advocacy groups, describing the beatings and the conditions children were living under. Initial reports were met with challenges because the group operated on private property and claimed religious freedom protections. Investigators needed evidence, and evidence was hard to obtain when the group was so isolated and when members were trained to view law enforcement as enemies of God. The breakthrough came when more former members came forward, and when some of those members were willing to testify about specific incidents. Investigators began building a case based on the testimony of people who had witnessed or experienced the abuse firsthand. In 2017, authorities moved in and arrested Deborah Green and Peter Green, along with several other members of the leadership. The charges included child abuse and failing to report child abuse. The arrests sent shockwaves through what remained of the community. Some members insisted that the Greens were being persecuted for their faith and that the government had no right to interfere with their religious practices. Others saw the arrests as long overdue justice for years of harm. The case brought attention to the question of where religious freedom ends and criminal behavior begins, a question that courts have grappled with in multiple cases involving insular religious groups. The legal proceedings revealed the extent of the abuse that had taken place over decades. Witnesses testified about beatings that left children unable to sit or walk comfortably for days. They described a culture where violence was normalized and where children lived in constant fear of the next infraction that would result in punishment. Medical experts explained the physical and psychological harm that resulted from prolonged abuse. The defense argued that the Greens were exercising their religious beliefs and their parental rights to discipline children as they saw fit. They claimed that the punishments were forms of corporal discipline that were legal in many contexts, and that the state was overreaching by prosecuting religious practices. But prosecutors argued that what happened at the compound went far beyond legal corporal punishment and crossed the line into criminal abuse. They pointed to the severity of the beatings, the frequency, the ages of the children involved, and the long-term harm that resulted. In the end, Deborah Green and Peter Green were convicted on multiple counts of child abuse. Deborah was sentenced to 13 years in prison, while Peter received a shorter sentence. Other members of the leadership received varying sentences based on their level of involvement. The convictions sent a clear message that religious beliefs do not provide immunity from prosecution when children are harmed. The compound in Fence Lake was eventually abandoned, and the remaining members scattered. Some continued to insist that the Greens had done nothing wrong, while others worked to rebuild their lives and to process the trauma they had experienced. Children who had grown up in the group faced the difficult task of adjusting to a world they had been taught to fear and learning to trust adults after years of abuse disguised as godly discipline. The case of Aggressive Christianity Missions Training Corps is a reminder that isolation and unchecked authority create conditions where abuse can flourish. For years, children suffered in a place that called itself a ministry, but functioned more like a prison. The people who harmed them believed they were serving God, which made them all the more convinced that they were right, and that anyone who opposed them was serving evil. The children had no advocates and no escape until former members found the courage to speak up and until the legal system decided that faith was not a shield for cruelty. The scars left by years of beatings and psychological control do not disappear quickly, and many of those who grew up in the compound are still working through the effects decades later. What was done to them in the name of Christianity was not love, and it was not discipline. It was abuse, and the courts finally recognized it as such. Number 4. Samuel Bateman's polygamist cult. In the small communities scattered across the Arizona-Utah border, whispers began circulating about a man who claimed to be a prophet with a message that even other polygamist groups found extreme. Samuel Bateman was not born into leadership or raised in a prominent family within the Fundamentalist movement. He was a relative, newcomer who emerged in the late 2010s, declaring that he had received revelations from God and that he was called to gather followers and establish a community based on principles that went beyond what even the FLDS practiced. Bateman was charismatic and confident, speaking with absolute certainty about divine mandates. He attracted followers who were dissatisfied with other groups or who were drawn to his claims of special authority. He established a presence in Colorado City, Arizona, the same town that had been home to Warren Jeffs and the FLDS, and he began building a following that included families willing to rearrange their entire lives based on his teachings. What made Bateman different from other polygamous leaders was not just his doctrine, but his willingness to push boundaries that even hardened fundamentalists considered dangerous. Bateman taught that he was called to take plural wives, and that God had specifically commanded him to marry young girls. He claimed that these marriages were not only permissible, but necessary for the salvation of the girls and for the building of God's kingdom on earth. He presented himself as a humble servant following divine orders, but his actions revealed a pattern of manipulation and control that went far beyond religious conviction. Bateman began marrying girls who were well below the age of consent, performing ceremonies that had no legal standing but carried enormous weight within his group. He convinced parents that giving their daughters to him was an act of faith that would secure blessings for the entire family. Some parents resisted, but others complied, either because they believed his claims or because they feared the consequences of refusing a man who said he spoke for God. Bateman did not keep his activities secret within his group. He openly acknowledged his young brides and even posted about his family on social media, though he carefully avoided language that would explicitly reveal the ages of the girls or the nature of the relationships. The community Bateman built was small, but tightly controlled. Families lived in homes that Bateman selected, and members followed schedules and rules that he established. He dictated what people wore, what they ate, and how they spent their time. He required absolute obedience and framed any resistance as rebellion against God. Children in the group were taught that Bateman was a prophet and that his word was law. Girls were groomed from a young age to accept that they might be called to marry him or another man in the group regardless of their age or their wishes. Bateman used religious language to justify every demand and every arrangement, creating an environment where questioning him was equated with questioning God. He also used technology in ways that previous polygamous leaders had avoided, maintaining contact with followers through phones and encrypted messaging apps, and even sharing photos and videos that documented his life and his family. This digital footprint would later become crucial evidence. Concerns about Bateman began surfacing in 2021 when people outside his group started noticing the young girls he claimed as wives. Some former members of other polygamous groups recognized what was happening and reported it to authorities. Child protection agencies began investigating, But Bateman was elusive and moved frequently between Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and other states. He seemed to stay one step ahead of investigators, relocating before authorities could act. In August 2022, Bateman was pulled over in Flagstaff, Arizona, during a traffic stop. Officers discovered 3 young girls in a trailer attached to his vehicle. The trailer was not designed for passengers and had no ventilation or safety features. The girls were locked inside in the heat, and their presence raised immediate red flags. Bateman was arrested on the spot, and the girls were taken into protective custody. The traffic stop opened the door to a much larger investigation. As authorities dug deeper, they uncovered a network of families spread across multiple states who were all connected to Bateman and his teachings. Investigators found evidence that Bateman had married more than 20 women, many of whom were minors. Some were as young as 11 or 12 when the ceremonies took place. He had fathered children with several of his young brides, and DNA evidence later confirmed those relationships. Authorities also discovered that Bateman had transported minors across state lines for illegal purposes, which brought federal charges into play. The FBI became involved, and what started as a local investigation turned into a multi-state operation. Agents executed search warrants on properties associated with Bateman and his followers, seizing phones, computers, documents, and other evidence. What they found painted a disturbing picture of systematic exploitation disguised as religious practice. Bateman was charged with multiple federal offenses, including conspiracy to transport minors for illegal activity, transportation of minors, and tampering with evidence. State charges were also filed in Arizona. As the case developed, prosecutors revealed that Bateman had not only married young girls, but had also encouraged his adult male followers to do the same. He orchestrated marriages between grown men and children, claiming that these unions were commanded by God. He directed his followers to lie to authorities and to hide the girls when investigators came looking. He coached people on how to avoid detection and how to present a false narrative if questioned. Some of his followers complied completely, viewing cooperation with law enforcement as betrayal of their faith. Others began to waver as the legal pressure mounted and as they realized the severity of the charges. The legal process moved quickly once the evidence was compiled. In 2023, Samuel Bateman pleaded guilty to conspiracy to transport minors and tampering with evidence. The plea deal came after prosecutors made it clear that they had overwhelming evidence, including electronic communications, witness testimony, and DNA results. Bateman admitted to orchestrating the transportation of minors across state lines and to engaging in conduct that harmed children. His guilty plea meant that some of the victims would not have to testify in a public trial, sparing them additional trauma. In early 2024, Bateman was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. The judge described his actions as calculated and predatory, rejecting any argument that religious belief justified what he had done. The sentence ensures that Bateman will be incarcerated well into his 70s, effectively removing him from society for the majority of his remaining life. Several of Bateman's followers also face charges. Some of the adult women who had helped facilitate the marriages and who had concealed information from authorities were prosecuted. A few cooperated with investigators and received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony. Others remained defiant, insisting that they had done nothing wrong and that the government was persecuting them for their faith. The children who had been trapped in Bateman's group were placed with family members outside the community or into foster care. Social workers and therapists began the long process of helping them understand that what happened to them was not normal and not their fault. Some of the girls who had been married to Bateman or to other men in the group faced the difficult reality of having children at very young ages and needing to rebuild their lives from scratch. The case highlighted the ongoing problem of polygamist groups that operate on the fringes of society and use religious freedom as a cover for criminal activity. Bateman was not an isolated figure, but part of a broader movement of fundamentalist groups that reject mainstream laws and norms. His rise was enabled by a network of believers who were willing to follow a charismatic leader without questioning his demands. The parents who handed over their daughters believed they were securing spiritual blessings, but they were complicit in crimes that destroyed childhoods and futures. The communities that sheltered Bateman and his followers allowed the abuse to continue for years before anyone outside intervened. Even after his arrest, some supporters continued to defend him, demonstrating how deeply indoctrination can run and how difficult it is to break free from a system that frames obedience as faith and resistance as sin. Samuel Bateman's conviction marked the end of his operation, but the damage he caused will take generations to heal. The girls who lost years of their lives to his control will carry those experiences forever, and the families torn apart by his teachings will never be the same. Number 5. Love has won. In the mountains of Colorado, a group of people gathered around a woman who claimed to be God incarnate. Amy Carlson called herself Mother God and told her followers that she was a divine being who had lived over 500 lifetimes and had come to Earth to save humanity from an apocalypse. She said she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, Cleopatra, and Marilyn Monroe all rolled into one. Her group, known as Love Has Won, started as an online spiritual community in the early 2010s and gradually evolved into a full-fledged organization with followers who lived together and dedicated their lives to serving Mother God. They streamed daily videos on YouTube and Facebook where Carlson would deliver rambling lectures about ascension, cosmic frequencies, and the coming shift in consciousness. To outsiders scrolling past their content, it looked like another fringe New Age group peddling conspiracy theories and pseudoscience. But for the people living inside the group, it was their entire reality, and the woman they worshipped as God was leading them down a path that would end in one of the strangest and most disturbing cult cases in recent memory. Amy Carlson was born in Kansas in 1975 and lived a relatively normal life for many years. She was married, had children, and worked regular jobs, including a stint managing a McDonald's restaurant. But by her 30s, she had become interested in New Age spirituality and began exploring ideas about enlightenment and higher consciousness. She started an online presence where she discussed spiritual topics and attracted a small following of people who resonated with her message. Over time, her claims became more grandiose. She began saying that she was not just a spiritual teacher, but an actual divine being. She told her followers that she was Mother God, the feminine aspect of the divine creator, and that she had descended to Earth to lead humanity into a new era. Her followers, who called themselves the First Contact Ground Crew Team, believed every word. They saw her as a living goddess who possessed supernatural abilities and who would soon transform the world. The group operated out of a series of houses in Colorado, moving frequently as landlords evicted them or as neighbors complained. Life inside the Love Has Won household was chaotic and intense. Members worked around the clock to produce content for their online platforms, to manage the website where they sold spiritual products, and to care for Mother God, who required constant attention. Carlson did not work or contribute to household tasks. She spent her days drinking large amounts of vodka, which she claimed was not alcohol, but a sacred elixir. She also consumed colloidal silver, a substance that some alternative health advocates claim has healing properties, but that can cause serious side effects, including a condition called argyria that turns the skin blue-gray. Carlson's skin took on a grayish hue, but her followers were told this was a sign of her ascension and her transformation into a higher being. She chain-smoked cigarettes and berated her followers for hours during live streams, calling them names and accusing them of not being devoted enough. The verbal abuse was constant, but members accepted it as part of their spiritual training. Followers were told that serving Mother God was the highest calling and that they were part of a mission to save the planet. Many gave up jobs, severed ties with family members who questioned their involvement, and turned over money and resources to support the group. Some followers had children who lived in the chaotic environment, exposed to the bizarre teachings and the erratic behavior of Carlson and the inner circle. The group taught that doctors were evil and that medicine was poison, so illnesses went untreated. They believed that positive thinking and spiritual energy could heal anything. As Carlson's health deteriorated from years of alcohol abuse and colloidal silver consumption, the group insisted that she was ascending to a higher dimension and that her physical body was simply transforming. They refused to seek medical help, even as she became increasingly incapacitated. By 2021, Carlson was barely able to move or speak coherently, but her followers continued to care for her and to broadcast her condition online as if it were a spiritual event. In April 2021, Amy Carlson died. The exact cause of death was later determined to be a combination of alcohol abuse, anorexia, and colloidal silver toxicity. She was 45 years old, but instead of reporting her death to authorities, the group made a shocking decision. They believed that Mother God would come back to life because she was divine and that her body needed to be preserved until her resurrection. They wrapped her body in a sleeping bag, placed it in a makeshift shrine, and kept it in the house. Some members applied makeup to her face and decorated the area around her body with Christmas lights and glitter. They continued to live in the house with the body for weeks, apparently waiting for a miracle that never came. The situation came to light when a concerned follower who had left the group tipped off authorities about what was happening. In late April, police in the small town of Moffett, Colorado, received a report about a body being kept in a home. When officers arrived at the residence, they found several members of Love Has Won and discovered Amy Carlson's mummified remains. Her body was wrapped in a sleeping bag and decorated in the bizarre shrine. The condition of the body indicated that she had been dead for several weeks. The group members present were cooperative, but seemed confused about why police were involved. They insisted that Mother God was not dead, but ascending, and that they had done nothing wrong. 7 people were arrested at the scene and charged with abuse of a corpse, a felony in Colorado. The arrest made national headlines and brought attention to Love Has Won and its unusual beliefs. The mugshots of the arrested members showed people who appeared exhausted and disconnected from reality. As investigators dug into the group's history, they found years of concerning behavior, including allegations of child abuse and neglect. The legal process revealed the full extent of the dysfunction within Love Has Won. Prosecutors argued that the group had not only failed to report Carlson's death, but had actively concealed it and had kept the body in conditions that were disrespectful and illegal. The defense argued that the members were following religious beliefs and that they genuinely thought Carlson would return to life. Mental health experts who evaluated some of the defendants noted that years of isolation and indoctrination had warped their sense of reality. Several of the arrested members eventually accepted plea deals. They were convicted of abuse of a corpse and received sentences ranging from probation to jail time. Some expressed remorse and acknowledged that they had been manipulated, while others continued to defend their actions and insisted that Amy Carlson was still a divine being. The case also brought attention to the children who had been living in the Love Has Won households. Child Protective Services intervened, and several children were removed from the care of group members. Investigators found evidence that children had been exposed to neglect and had witnessed disturbing behavior, including the veneration of Carlson's corpse. The children were placed with relatives or into foster care, and efforts were made to provide them with counseling and stability. Former members of Love Has Won began speaking out about their experiences, describing how they had been drawn in by promises of spiritual enlightenment and community, but had found themselves trapped in a group that demanded total devotion to a deeply troubled leader. They talked about the manipulation, the sleep deprivation, the constant fundraising, and the emotional abuse that Carlson inflicted on anyone who displeased her. Amy Carlson's body was eventually released to family members and cremated. The house where she died was cleaned and returned to normal use. The Love Has Won organization fractured after her death, with some followers insisting that she would still return, and others drifting away to rebuild their lives. A few tried to continue the group under new leadership, but the momentum was gone. The bizarre nature of the case captured public fascination and led to documentaries and articles examining how a woman from Kansas convinced people she was God, and how those people ended up living with her mummified body while waiting for a resurrection that never happened. The story raised questions about the vulnerability of people seeking spiritual answers and the dangers of charismatic leaders who exploit that vulnerability. Love Has Won was not a traditional cult with a long history or a large following, but it demonstrated how quickly a group can form around a single individual who makes extreme claims and how technology can amplify that influence. Amy Carlson reached people across the country and even internationally through social media, drawing them into a worldview that isolated them from reality and from people who might have helped them see the truth. Her followers gave up everything for a promise of ascension that was never going to come. They ignored warning signs, accepted abuse, and convinced themselves that suffering was part of their spiritual path. When Carlson died, they could not accept it, because accepting it would mean admitting that everything they had believed and sacrificed for was a lie. So they kept her body and waited. And in doing so, they crossed a line that brought legal consequences they had never imagined. The case serves as a stark reminder that devotion without discernment can lead to tragedy, and that even in the age of information, people can be drawn into belief systems that defy logic and harm everyone involved. Number 6. Tony Alamo Christian Ministries. In the hills of Arkansas, a religious organization operated for decades under the leadership of a man who wore flashy suits, preached fiery sermons, and claimed to be doing God's work. Tony Alamo Christian Ministries attracted followers from across the country who were drawn to a message that mixed evangelical Christianity with conspiracy theories and apocalyptic warnings. The ministry ran businesses, published newspapers, and established compounds where members lived and worked together. Tony Alamo himself was a larger-than-life figure who had once worked in the music industry in Los Angeles before finding religion and reinventing himself as a pastor. He spoke with confidence and charisma, convincing people that he had special insight into the end times and that following him was the path to salvation. The ministry seemed successful from the outside, with properties in multiple states and a media operation that reached thousands. But former members who eventually escaped told stories of exploitation, control, and abuse that had been hidden behind the religious facade for years. What Tony Alamo built was not just a church, but a system designed to serve his own desires while keeping his followers trapped in fear and obedience. Tony Alamo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Missouri in 1934. He moved to Los Angeles as a young man and worked in the entertainment industry as a promoter and record producer. He married Susan Lipowitz, and together they became born-again Christians in the 1960s. They founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in 1969, initially operating as a street ministry in Hollywood. They attracted young people who were part of the counterculture movement and who were searching for meaning. The ministry grew, and the Alamos moved their base to Arkansas, where they established a compound and began building a following. Susan Alamo was considered a co-leader and was deeply involved in the ministry until her death from cancer in 1982. Her death marked a turning point for Tony Alamo, who refused to accept that she was gone. He had her body embalmed and kept it on display at the ministry compound for months, telling followers that God would resurrect her. The resurrection never happened, but Alamo's grip on his followers only tightened. After Susan's death, Tony Alamo's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He declared himself the sole authority in the ministry and demanded absolute obedience from all members. He taught that the government was evil, that mainstream churches were corrupt, and that he alone had the truth. Members lived on ministry compounds where they worked long hours in businesses that Alamo operated, including clothing factories and construction crews. They received no wages because Alamo taught that working for the ministry was serving God, and that money was not necessary for those living in community. The ministry made substantial profits from these businesses, but the workers saw none of it. Alamo lived lavishly while his followers lived in cramped conditions with minimal food and basic necessities. He wore expensive jewelry and drove luxury cars, justifying his wealth by claiming that God had blessed him and that he deserved the best. The darkest aspect of Tony Alamo's ministry involved his treatment of young girls. Beginning in the 1990s and continuing for years, Alamo took multiple child brides. He claimed that God had commanded him to marry these girls and that the marriages were spiritually legitimate, even if they were not legally recognized. He performed ceremonies where he married girls as young as 8 or 9 years old, and he consummated these marriages when the girls were barely into their teens. He convinced parents to give their daughters to him by framing it as a divine mandate and by suggesting that refusing would result in damnation for the entire family. Some parents complied out of fear, while others were true believers who thought they were doing the right thing. The girls had no choice and no voice. They were told that they were now wives of the prophet and that their role was to serve and obey. Alamo rotated through young brides, discarding them as they got older and bringing in new ones. He also arranged marriages between adult men in the ministry and underage girls, creating a culture where child marriage was normalized and where questioning it was considered rebellion against God. Former members who left the ministry in the 1990s and 2000s began speaking out about the abuse they had witnessed and experienced. They described a climate of fear where people were beaten for infractions, where children were denied education and medical care, and where young girls were forced into marriages they did not want. Some former members contacted law enforcement, but initial investigations struggled to gain traction. Alamo moved frequently between properties in Arkansas, Oklahoma, and other states, making it difficult to pin down his location. He also had loyal followers who would lie to authorities and who would hide people if investigators came looking. The ministry operated in isolated compounds where outsiders were not welcome and where members were taught to distrust anyone from the outside world. Breaking through that wall of secrecy required persistence and the courage of survivors who were willing to testify despite the emotional cost. The breakthrough came in 2008 when federal authorities raided Tony Alamo Christian Ministries properties in Arkansas. The raids were the result of years of investigation into allegations of child abuse and other crimes. Agents searched multiple locations and seized documents, computers, and other evidence. They also interviewed dozens of former members and people who had been part of the ministry as children. The evidence they gathered painted a clear picture of systematic abuse. In 2009, Tony Alamo was indicted on federal charges related to transporting minors across state lines for illegal purposes. The charges stemmed from his practice of taking young brides and moving them between different ministry properties in multiple states. The case went to trial in Arkansas, and prosecutors presented testimony from several women who had been child brides of Alamo. These women, now adults, described in painful detail what had been done to them when they were children. They talked about being married to Alamo in ceremonies that had no legal standing, but that carried enormous weight within the ministry. They described being taken to different states and being told that they had to submit to Alamo because he was God's representative on earth. The trial was emotional and difficult for the survivors who testified. They faced cross-examination from Alamo's defense attorneys, who attempted to discredit their stories and to suggest that they were lying or confused. Alamo himself maintained that he had done nothing wrong and that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. He claimed that the government was targeting him because he spoke the truth and that the charges were fabricated. But the jury heard the testimony of multiple victims who all told consistent stories about what had happened to them. They heard from former members who had witnessed the marriages and the abuse. They saw documents and photographs that corroborated the testimony. After deliberating, the jury found Tony Alamo guilty on all 10 counts of transporting minors for illegal activity. The verdict was a moment of validation for the survivors who had waited years for justice. In 2009, Tony Alamo was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge rejected any suggestion that religious belief justified what Alamo had done, stating clearly that the law protects children regardless of what religious doctrines are claimed. Alamo was defiant even after sentencing, insisting that he was innocent and that he would be vindicated. He filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. He remained in federal custody and continued to send messages to his remaining followers, maintaining that he was still the leader of the ministry and that God would deliver him. In 2017, Tony Alamo died in prison at the age of 82. His death brought an end to a life that had caused immeasurable harm to dozens of children and to the families who had been torn apart by his teachings. The Tony Alamo Christian Ministries gradually dissolved after his conviction. Some properties were seized by the government and others were sold. A few loyal followers continued to believe in Alamo even after his death, but most drifted away or acknowledged that they had been deceived. The survivors faced the long process of rebuilding their lives after years of trauma. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, working to raise awareness about the dangers of insular religious groups and the ways that charismatic leaders can exploit faith for their own purposes. They have described the difficulty of leaving a group where you have been told your entire life that the outside world is evil, and that questioning the leader is the same as questioning God. They have talked about the shame and confusion that comes with realizing that what you were taught was love, and devotion was actually abuse and manipulation. The case of Tony Alamo Christian Ministries is a stark example of how religious authority can be twisted into a tool for exploitation. Tony Alamo used the Bible and the language of faith to justify taking children as brides and to create a system where he lived in luxury while his followers worked for nothing. He convinced parents to hand over their daughters by framing it as obedience to God, and he silenced dissent by accusing questioners of having evil spirits or rebellious hearts. The children who grew up in his ministry were robbed of normal childhoods and subjected to experiences that no child should ever endure. The girls who were married to him carried scars that would never fully heal. The families who gave years of their lives to the ministry emerged with nothing but trauma and regret. Tony Alamo's conviction and imprisonment sent a message that religious leaders are not above the law and that claiming divine authority does not grant permission to harm children. But for the victims, the legal victory could not undo what had been done. It could only ensure that Alamo would not be free to harm anyone else, and that the world would know the truth about what had happened behind the walls of his ministry. Number 7. John Coltharp's Polygamist Sect. In the desert landscape of southern Utah, a group of children vanished without a trace in late 2017, sparking an investigation that would expose a polygamist sect operating in secrecy and pushing extremist beliefs to dangerous new levels. The children belonged to families connected to John Coltharp and Samuel Schaffer, two men who had broken away from other fundamentalist groups to form their own community based on revelations they claimed to receive directly from God. Coltharp and Schaffer were not content with simply practicing plural marriage as other groups did. They taught that the end times were imminent and that their followers needed to separate completely from society and live in hidden places where they could prepare for the apocalypse. They preached that government authority was illegitimate and that anyone who cooperated with law enforcement or social services was betraying God. The group was small and insular, made up of just a few families, but the level of control and the willingness to defy the law made it particularly volatile. When the children disappeared, authorities launched a search that would take them across state lines and into remote wilderness areas where the group had gone to hide. John Coltharp had been involved in fundamentalist Mormon communities for years before forming his own group. He was a true believer in plural marriage and in the idea that modern society was corrupt and destined for destruction. He had multiple wives and numerous children, and he homeschooled them according to his own religious views. Samuel Schaffer was similarly committed to fundamentalist principles and had his own plural family. The two men met through connections in the broader polygamist community and discovered they shared a belief that existing fundamentalist groups had become too compromising and too willing to coexist with the outside world. They decided to form their own group, where they could practice a pure version of their faith without interference. They taught that God had chosen them to lead, and that their followers needed to be willing to sacrifice everything, including relationships with extended family and any ties to the outside world. The group lived in rural areas of southern Utah, moving between different properties and keeping a low profile. In December 2017, authorities in Iron County, Utah, became aware that several children associated with John Coltharp and Samuel Schaffer could not be located. Family members who were not part of the group had raised concerns that the children were being kept hidden and possibly subjected to unsafe conditions. Child Protective Services attempted to check on the welfare of the children, but Coltharp and Schaffer refused to cooperate. They would not allow social workers to see the children and would not provide information about where the children were. A court ordered that the children be produced for a welfare check, but the order was ignored. It became clear that the group had taken the children and gone into hiding. Law enforcement launched a search, but finding them in the vast and rugged terrain of southern Utah was a significant challenge. The group had prepared for this scenario and had supplies and locations arranged in advance. The search involved multiple agencies, including local sheriffs, departments, the FBI, and Child Protective Services. Investigators interviewed family members, searched properties associated with the group, and followed tips from people who had spotted suspicious activity in remote areas. For weeks, the children remained missing while temperatures dropped and winter conditions set in. The authorities grew increasingly concerned that the children were in danger from exposure, lack of food, or medical emergencies. The group's belief that they were following divine commands made them unpredictable, and there was fear that they might do something drastic if cornered. In early December, investigators received information that the group might be hiding in the Arizona Strip, a remote area of northern Arizona that is difficult to access and sparsely populated. Search teams focused their efforts on that region, using helicopters and ground teams to cover the rugged terrain. On December 12, 2017, searchers found the group in a remote area near the Utah-Arizona border. The children, 9 in total, were discovered in makeshift shelters that offered minimal protection from the elements. They had been living in cargo trailers and outdoor enclosures that were not designed for habitation, especially not in winter. The conditions were harsh, and the children were cold and malnourished. Some were wearing inadequate clothing for the weather, and they had been surviving on limited food supplies. The adults with the children, including John Coltharp and Samuel Schaffer, were taken into custody, and the children were removed and placed in protective care. The discovery ended the immediate crisis, but it opened the door to legal proceedings that would determine what consequences the adults would face for putting the children in such dangerous conditions. John Coltharp and Samuel Schaffer were charged with multiple counts, including kidnapping and child abuse. The prosecution argued that the men had deliberately defied court orders, had taken the children into hiding in dangerous conditions, and had put the children's lives at risk in service of their own religious beliefs. The defense argued that the men were exercising their religious freedom and their parental rights, and that they were simply trying to protect their families from what they saw as government overreach. They claimed that the conditions in the desert were not as bad as prosecutors suggested, and that the children were never in serious danger. But the evidence told a different story. Photos and testimony from the scene showed children who were cold, hungry, and living in conditions that no child should have to endure. Medical evaluations revealed that some of the children had lost weight and were showing signs of neglect. The case went to trial in 2018, and the courtroom proceedings laid bare the extent of the group's isolation and the lengths to which the leaders had gone to avoid legal authority. Witnesses testified about the preparations that had been made to hide the children and about conversations where Coltharp and Schaffer had discussed their willingness to defy any court order they believed violated their religious principles. Former associates of the men testified about the increasingly extreme nature of their teachings and about concerns that the group was becoming dangerous. The jury heard from social workers and law enforcement officers who described the condition of the children when they were found and the efforts that had been required to locate them. The defense presented character witnesses who spoke about the men's dedication to their families and their sincere religious beliefs, but the evidence of harm to the children was overwhelming. In the end, John Coltharp was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping and child abuse. He was sentenced to a substantial prison term that reflected the seriousness of the charges and the danger he had put the children in. Samuel Schaffer also faced charges, though his case followed a somewhat different trajectory as he negotiated a plea deal. Other adults in the group who had been involved in hiding the children faced lesser charges, with some receiving probation and others serving shorter jail sentences. The convictions sent a message that using religious belief as justification for putting children in danger would not be tolerated, and that defying court orders designed to protect children would result in serious consequences. The children were placed in the care of family members who were not part of the extremist group or into foster care where they could receive proper medical attention, education, and counseling. The case raised broader questions about how authorities should respond when religious groups go to extreme lengths to avoid outside oversight. There is a long history in the Western United States of polygamist groups that operate on the fringes of society and that view government authority with deep suspicion. Most of these groups, while practicing beliefs that mainstream society rejects, do not engage in the kind of behavior that Coltharp and Schaffer did. But when leaders become convinced that they are above the law and that they have a divine mandate to resist any form of accountability, the potential for harm increases dramatically. The children who were hidden in the desert had no say in what was happening to them. They were cold, scared, and uncertain about why they were living in trailers in the wilderness instead of in homes with heat and regular meals. Their parents and the adults around them were so convinced of their righteousness that they could not see the harm they were causing. John Coltharp's conviction did not end his commitment to his beliefs. Even from prison, he maintained that he had done nothing wrong and that he was being persecuted for his faith. Some of his followers continued to support him, sending letters and money and insisting that the government had acted unjustly. But the children who had been in his care were finally in environments where their basic needs were being met and where they had access to education and medical care. The case became part of the ongoing conversation about where religious freedom ends and where the responsibility to protect children begins. Courts have consistently held that parents do not have unlimited authority over their children, and that religious belief does not grant permission to neglect or endanger them. The Coltharp case reinforced that principle in dramatic fashion, showing that even sincere religious conviction cannot justify actions that put children in harm's way. The images of those children being rescued from the desert, wrapped in blankets, and carried to safety became a powerful reminder of what happens when ideology overrides basic human compassion and common sense. Number 8. Royal Jenkins and the United Nation of Islam. In the late 1970s, a man named Royal Jenkins claimed that he had been taken aboard a spaceship and shown divine truths by angels. When he returned, he declared that he was Allah in the flesh and began forming what would become known as the United Nation of Islam. Based in Kansas City, Kansas, this group would gain national attention decades later for allegations of cult-like control, forced labor, and abuse. Jenkins's story began when he broke away from the Nation of Islam after the death of Elijah Muhammad. He told followers that he had been transported around the solar system by angels who revealed to him that black men were the original rulers of the earth and that he had been chosen to lead them back to power. His teachings mixed elements of Islam, black nationalism, and his own invented doctrines. By the 1990s, he had gathered a loyal group of followers who viewed him as a divine being and obeyed his instructions without question. They lived communally, surrendered their income, and were told that obedience to Jenkins was obedience to God himself. For outsiders, it seemed like an eccentric religious group. For insiders, it was a tightly controlled world where questioning the leader was considered a spiritual crime. The United Nation of Islam operated businesses including bakeries, restaurants, and cleaning services. On the surface, these ventures appeared legitimate, but former members later described them as fronts for unpaid labor. Men, women, and even children reportedly worked long hours under strict supervision, with all profits going directly to Jenkins. He lived in luxury, while followers lived in group homes with limited freedom. According to former members, Jenkins separated families, assigned marriages, and decided who could have children. He taught that women were spiritually inferior and should be completely subservient to men, particularly to him. Members were told to refer to him as Allah in person and to avoid any contact with outsiders who questioned his authority. He dictated everything from clothing to diet to relationships, claiming that his orders were divine revelation. Over time, the environment became one of fear and obedience. Many followers believed that leaving the group meant eternal damnation or even physical harm. In 2017, the facade began to crumble. Several former members filed lawsuits accusing the organization of human trafficking, labor violations, and psychological abuse. They alleged that Jenkins had forced them to work in the group's businesses without pay, and that he had kept them in a state of dependency by controlling their housing and finances. Investigations by reporters and federal authorities revealed disturbing patterns. Teenagers pulled from school to work full-time, adults forbidden to seek medical care, and women pressured into serving Jenkins personally. The group had operated largely undisturbed for years because members were reluctant to come forward, and those who did were often discredited or intimidated. But as more former members spoke out, a clearer picture emerged of a system built on coercion disguised as faith. Court filings described a hierarchy where Jenkins's word was law. He claimed to be over 700 years old, the creator of the universe, and immune to human law. His inner circle helped enforce his rules, ensuring loyalty through constant surveillance and public humiliation of dissenters. The cult's businesses expanded across several states, including Georgia, Maryland, and New York, generating income that kept Jenkins's operation running for decades. When members questioned why they were unpaid, they were told that serving Allah was its own reward. When one follower attempted to leave, others were instructed to retrieve them by force. Families torn apart by the group described years of isolation, as communication with relatives outside was banned. The lawsuits gained traction in the late 2010s as more victims came forward. Federal investigators looked into possible violations of labor and trafficking laws. Although Jenkins was never criminally convicted before his death in 2021, the civil cases exposed the extent of his manipulation. His passing did not dissolve the organization. Leadership disputes followed, and splinter groups continued to operate under variations of his teachings. Former members who escaped told journalists that it took years to recover from the psychological control. Some had been born into the group and knew no life beyond Jenkins's authority. During court testimony, victims recounted how Jenkins convinced them that their work was part of a divine mission to rebuild a black nation. He warned that the government was evil and that outsiders were agents of Satan. This worldview left members trapped between fear of damnation and fear of the world beyond. Advocates and cult recovery experts noted how his control mirrored that of other authoritarian leaders, using religion to justify total obedience. The United Nation of Islam had the trappings of faith, but its function was control. By the early 2020s, the organization's properties were under investigation for labor law violations, and several affiliated businesses closed. Survivors began speaking publicly, helping others recognize signs of coercive groups. They described the emotional toll of realizing that their devotion had been exploited for profit and power. Despite the exposure, some followers still viewed Jenkins as divine and awaited his return. Royal Jenkins's story remains a cautionary tale about how charisma, isolation, and religious manipulation can merge into a system of exploitation. His claims of divine authority allowed him to build a world where his word replaced law, and where devotion became a tool for control. For decades, men and women believed they were serving God when in truth they were serving one man's delusion. Even after his death, the scars of that belief remain, and the legacy of the United Nation of Islam stands as a sobering reminder of how easily faith can be twisted into a cage when power goes unchecked. Number 9. Jacob Gardner and the Black Hebrew Israelites, House of Prayer. In the late 2000s, a small congregation known as the House of Prayer for All People drew attention in Baltimore for its intense preaching and strict rules. On the surface, it seemed to be one of many groups connected to the broader Black Hebrew Israelite movement, a collection of sects teaching that African Americans are descendants of the ancient Israelites. But inside the walls of this particular house of prayer, led by Jacob Gardner, faith had been reshaped into something darker. Gardner, who claimed to be a prophet sent to restore the true faith of the chosen people, ruled his congregation with fear, manipulation, and violence. What began as passionate sermons about identity and redemption slowly turned into psychological control and physical domination, ultimately leading to tragedy and imprisonment. Jacob Gardner was once a respected street preacher who attracted followers with his deep knowledge of Scripture and his message of self-empowerment. He taught that mainstream Christianity had misled black people for centuries, and that only by returning to the laws of Israel could they find salvation. His church started small, operating out of rented halls before purchasing its own building in West Baltimore. Members were drawn in by Gardner's intensity and by his promise that they were part of a divine plan. At first, it felt like a family. Members worshiped together, shared meals, and spent long nights studying Scripture. Gardner spoke of moral purity and divine order, but gradually his interpretation of Scripture began to focus on absolute obedience to him. He insisted that he was the chosen messenger of God, and that disobeying him was equivalent to defying heaven itself. As his control grew, Gardner imposed strict rules on his followers. Members were told to cut off family outside the group, give up personal possessions, and live communally in housing owned by the church. Women were required to cover themselves completely, and couples could only marry or have children with his approval. He claimed that these restrictions were based on ancient laws, but in reality, they were tools to isolate and control. Gardner began using public humiliation to enforce loyalty, berating anyone who questioned him during sermons. Over time, the group developed an inner circle of devoted followers who acted as enforcers. They reported anyone who showed doubt, and they carried out punishments he ordered. In 2012, the situation turned criminal. Several former members contacted authorities and described a pattern of abuse inside the church. They said that Gardner had been using threats of divine punishment to coerce labor and that he had physically assaulted followers who disobeyed him. Investigators found that some members had been living in conditions resembling forced servitude, working long hours at properties controlled by the church without pay. Others said they were denied medical care or forced to fast for extended periods as spiritual cleansing. These accounts matched reports from other cities where radical black Hebrew Israelite sects had faced similar accusations, but Gardner's version of the movement was uniquely personal, built entirely around his authority as a self-declared prophet. Police raided one of the group's buildings in late 2012, finding several adults and children living in overcrowded rooms with minimal food and locked doors. Gardner and several senior members were arrested and charged with a range of offenses, including assault, false imprisonment, and child endangerment. During questioning, Gardner defended himself as a man of God under persecution, insisting that the accusations were lies from people who had lost faith. His followers echoed that claim, some even calling him King Israel. But the evidence was extensive. Investigators uncovered financial records showing that all member income was funneled through Gardner's control, and testimony from former followers described years of manipulation and psychological coercion. The trial began in 2014 and revealed the depth of Gardner's control. Prosecutors presented witnesses who recounted how Gardner told his congregation that God would strike them down if they left. Some said they watched him physically punish members in front of others to instill fear. The defense tried to frame his leadership as strict but religiously justified, arguing that the allegations exaggerated church discipline practices. However, the jury saw clear patterns of abuse. Former members described losing touch with their families for years, having their mail monitored, and being forced to surrender government benefits to the church. Children were homeschooled under his teachings and rarely allowed outside contact. When the verdict came, Jacob Gardner was convicted on multiple counts including assault, child neglect, and unlawful imprisonment. He was sentenced to several decades in state prison, effectively dismantling the house of prayer sect he had built. Some of his remaining loyalists attempted to regroup under new names, but law enforcement and social service agencies kept close watch. The building that once served as the group's church was later sold, standing as a grim reminder of how faith can be manipulated into control when power is unchecked. In prison, Gardner continued to call himself a prophet, sending letters to former followers claiming that his imprisonment fulfilled biblical prophecy. A few still sent him money, but most moved on, rebuilding their lives outside the walls of his influence. Survivors spoke about the difficulty of reclaiming their sense of independence after years of control. Many had joined the group seeking identity and belonging, only to find themselves trapped in a system of fear and obedience. The fall of Jacob Gardner's House of Prayer revealed a familiar pattern seen in other extremist sects, one charismatic leader convincing others that salvation depends entirely on him. His manipulation of faith and identity turned something sacred into something deeply harmful. The Black Hebrew Israelite movement itself remains diverse, with most groups practicing peacefully, but Gardner's sect showed how isolation, absolute authority, and apocalyptic rhetoric can twist belief into coercion. His conviction closed one chapter, but the scars left on those who lived under his rule remain as a warning about how power, once mistaken for divine truth, can destroy the very people who believe in it most. Number 10. Michael Travisser and the Strong City Cult. In the quiet hills of Union County, New Mexico, a small religious community called Strong City promised salvation to its followers. Its leader, a man named Michael Travisser, claimed to be the Messiah and taught that the end of the world was imminent. What began as a peaceful Christian sect slowly turned into a closed-off, tightly controlled commune marked by manipulation, abuse, and fear. By the time authorities intervened, the world had not ended, but many lives inside Strong City had been irreversibly damaged. Michael Travisser, whose real name was Wayne Bent, once worked as a Seventh-day Adventist minister. Intelligent and charismatic, he had a talent for persuasion and a commanding presence that drew people to him. In the early 1980s, he began preaching unconventional interpretations of the Bible, claiming to receive direct revelations from God. He left the Adventist Church and formed his own following, first known as the Lord Our Righteousness Church. His sermons focused on purity, spiritual awakening, and preparing for the end times. He insisted that modern society was corrupt and that his followers needed to separate themselves completely from the outside world to survive the coming apocalypse. By the late 1990s, he had led dozens of followers to the remote high desert of northeastern New Mexico, where they built an isolated compound they called Strong City. Life inside Strong City revolved entirely around Travisser's teachings. Members lived communally, shared all possessions, and followed strict daily routines centered on prayer, fasting, and study. They were told that the world would soon end in fire, and that only those living in Strong City would be saved. Travisser declared himself the embodiment of Christ on earth and demanded total loyalty. Over time, his teachings became increasingly extreme. He claimed that true spiritual unity required followers to renounce traditional family bonds, and that he alone had the authority to decide what God required of each member. This doctrine fractured families and caused emotional turmoil among his followers. Many gave up contact with relatives who refused to join. In 2000, Travisser predicted that the world would end within 7 years. He said God had chosen Strong City as the place where the faithful would ascend when judgment arrived. Followers sold their possessions, abandoned careers, and cut ties with the outside world to prepare. When the predicted date passed without incident, Travisser reinterpreted the prophecy, saying the end had come spiritually rather than physically. For some, this explanation was enough. They believed even more deeply, convinced that their leader was being tested by God. For others, doubt began to grow, but fear of divine punishment kept them silent. In 2008, the illusion collapsed. A documentary crew from the BBC visited Strong City to film the group's daily life. Their footage showed disturbing patterns of control, including Traveser's claims that he had been commanded by God to engage in intimate acts of spiritual cleansing with young female followers. The documentary aired internationally and sparked public outrage. Soon after, New Mexico State Police launched an investigation. Former members came forward describing years of psychological abuse, isolation, and the belief that leaving the compound meant eternal damnation. Some said Traveser used his claimed divinity to justify behavior that blurred moral and legal boundaries, manipulating followers under the guise of faith. In May 2008, law enforcement raided Strong City. Officers arrested Traveser and several senior members after interviewing former followers who described troubling experiences. Prosecutors charged him with multiple counts, including criminal sexual contact and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The trial drew national media attention, with journalists descending on the small New Mexico town to cover what had once been an obscure religious enclave. In court, Traveser defended himself not as a criminal, but as a messenger of God, insisting that everything he had done was under divine instruction. His followers, many of whom still believed in him completely, attended the proceedings and described him as a man of purity who had been misunderstood by the outside world. The evidence, however, told a different story. Former members testified about how Traveser had groomed young followers, convincing them that obedience to him was obedience to God. Parents who had left the group spoke about their children's confusion and emotional distress after years of indoctrination. The prosecution argued that Traveser had used religion to manipulate and exploit vulnerable people who trusted him completely. The defense maintained that the acts in question were spiritual rituals taken out of context, but jurors were unconvinced. In December 2008, the jury found Michael Traveser guilty on 1 count of criminal sexual contact of a minor and 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. The judge sentenced him to 10 years in prison. Even then, Traveser showed no remorse. He told reporters that the court had condemned God himself and that his imprisonment fulfilled prophecy. His remaining followers continued to occupy Strong City, though their numbers dwindled as years passed. Many refused to believe that their leader was guilty, claiming his conviction was persecution for his faith. While in prison, Traveser continued to write letters to his followers, calling himself the Son of God in chains. He was released in 2016 after serving his sentence, but returned to a much smaller and fractured community. Some members had left to rebuild their lives, while a handful remained loyal, still living quietly on the original Strong City property. Traveser lived under supervision, largely isolated, until his death in 2021. The collapse of Strong City revealed the power of spiritual manipulation when faith becomes tied to one man's ego. Followers who joined seeking salvation found themselves in a system where questioning was forbidden and freedom was redefined as obedience. Many who escaped described years of confusion and guilt, struggling to separate their belief in God from their loyalty to Traveser. Counselors and religious scholars who studied the case said it fit a familiar pattern. A leader who begins with sincere conviction but gradually replaces divine authority with his own. Today, Strong City still exists, but only as a shadow of what it once was. A few homes remain on the land, inhabited by former followers who have since renounced Traveser's claims. The gates are closed to outsiders, and the once bustling community is now silent. The story of Michael Traveser stands as a warning about how even well-intentioned faith can be distorted when devotion turns into domination. What began as a quest for purity ended in a courtroom, where the man who once called himself the Messiah was forced to face the laws of the world he claimed was ending.